Chapter 1. The Stranger in the Cold. The wind howled like a pack of hungry coyotes outside the small log cabin. Snow whipped across the open plains, rattling the shutters and seeping through cracks in the wood. Inside, the fire in the stone hearth spat and hissed, throwing a restless orange glow across the single room. Luke Carver leaned back in his chair, hat tipped low over his brow, polishing the barrel of his Colt with slow, steady strokes. The night was long, the cold bitter, and he'd grown used to silence, preferred it even. But silence shattered when the faintest creak of the cabin door stirred his instincts. Luke froze, his hand still on the revolver, eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. He hadn't bolted that door tight. Not tonight. But out here in the frontier, visitors at this hour rarely came in peace. The door eased open on its hinges, letting in a slice of frigid air and a scatter of snowflakes. For a moment, Luke thought it might be the wind playing tricks. Then he saw her. A girl, no, a woman, though young, stumbled inside. Her dress was torn, edges stiff with frost, and she clutched the fabric around her shoulders as though it were a cloak. Hair plastered against her face, cheeks raw red from the wind. Her breath came out in shivers. Luke stood slow, revolver resting loosely at his side. His voice was low, rough from disuse. You're either lost or fool enough to sneak into a man's home uninvited. Which is it? The woman froze, blinking at the sight of the tall cowboy silhouetted in firelight. She swayed on her feet, gripping the doorframe as if she might collapse. Her lips trembled before words spilled out, raw and pleading. Please, don't send me back out there. I'll be useful, stay silent, just don't drive me out. Luke studied her, jaw working beneath the stubble. Strays weren't rare on the frontier. Drifters, runaways, folks with debts or worse chasing them. Trouble clung to them like dust to boots. He didn't need trouble. Yet there was something in her eyes. Fear, yes, but also the desperate spark of someone clinging to their last chance. You got a name? He asked after a long silence, the fire popping between them. Her gaze darted to the floorboards. Clara. She hugged herself tighter, shoulders shaking. That's all I'll say. Just let me warm myself by the fire. Luke exhaled through his nose, slow and steady. He should have thrown her back into the storm. He owed her nothing. But as she edged closer to the hearth, knees nearly buckling, he saw how thin her shoes were, how frost clung to her lashes like tiny shards of glass. Sit, he muttered, nodding toward the rough-hewn stool by the fire. She obeyed at once, sinking onto it, holding out trembling hands toward the flames. The fire painted her face in flickering gold, softening the bruises of cold and exhaustion. Luke set his revolver back on the table, but didn't sit. He leaned against the wall instead, arms crossed, watching her like a hawk. The cabin filled with the sound of her shallow breaths, the ticking of melting snow dripping from her dress onto the floorboards. Outside, the storm raged, but inside was tense, suspended. Clara finally looked up at him, eyes wide in the dim light. Thank you. Her voice cracked like brittle twine. I'll cook, clean, whatever you need. Just don't ask me to leave. Luke scratched at his jaw, staring at her as if she were some puzzle the desert winds had blown in. His life had been carved out of solitude, and he'd learned long ago that opening your door was the same as opening your heart to trouble. But something about the way she held herself, fighting to keep from breaking, stirred a feeling he hadn't let himself feel in years. You're staying the night, he said finally, his tone sharp but not unkind. After that, we'll see. Relief swept across her face, loosening the tight grip of her hands. She nodded quickly, biting back tears. Luke pulled his hat lower and sat back down, the chair creaking under his weight. He reached for the rifle leaning by the wall, checking its chamber more from habit than need. He could feel her eyes on him, could almost hear the silent prayers she carried. The wind outside battered the cabin, snow hissing against the roof. But within those four rough walls, a fragile truce had been struck. The stranger in the cold had found warmth for the night, and though Luke told himself he'd decide her fate come morning, deep down, some part of him knew nothing about his quiet life on the prairie would ever be the same. Chapter 2, A Cowboy's Silence. Morning broke slow across the prairie. The storm had passed, leaving a brittle stillness behind. The snow crusted over the ground like sheets of pale glass. Smoke curled lazily from the cabin's chimney, marking the only sign of life for miles in every direction. Inside, Luke Carver stood at the stove, the hiss of frying bacon and the scent of black coffee filling the air. He moved with practiced precision, hands steady, movements deliberate. Life on the frontier had taught him efficiency, silence, and wariness. Behind him, the stranger stirred. Clara, if that truly was her name, shifted under the wool blanket Luke had begrudgingly tossed her before dawn. She sat up slowly, blinking at the sun spilling in through the cracks of the shuttered window. Her voice was hoarse. I thought maybe it was a dream. Luke turned his head just enough to glance at her. Her hair was still damp from melted snow, curling at the edges. She looked small in his blanket, as if swallowed whole by the rough wool. Not a dream, he said, voice gravelly, like boots on dry gravel. You're in my cabin. Don't forget it. Her lips parted, but no words came. She only clutched the blanket tighter around her shoulders, eyes flicking toward the skillet where the bacon sizzled. Hunger burned there, raw and shameless, but she didn't ask. Luke plated the food, sliding a portion toward her on the rough-hewn table. Eat. You look like the wind could blow you clear into next week. Clara hesitated, then moved with surprising grace for someone half-starved. She sat, murmured a soft, "Thank you," and ate in silence. Each bite was careful, as though she feared the plate might be yanked away. Luke sat opposite, his own plate untouched for a long while as he studied her. His eyes were sharp beneath the brim of his hat. Finally, he broke the quiet. "You gonna tell me why you showed up near frozen on my doorstep?" Clara paused mid-bite. The fork trembled in her hand, then lowered the plate. She met his gaze only for a heartbeat before looking away. "I said all I need to. I've nowhere else to go." Luke leaned back in his chair, arms folding across his chest. His silence stretched heavy, broken only by the crackle of fire and the faint creak of timbers. "I don't keep secrets under my roof," he said at last. "Secrets get men killed. And women, too." She flinched at that, as though his words had struck something tender. But then she straightened, lifting her chin despite the shadows in her eyes. "Then maybe I should go." The chair legs scraped against the floor as Luke pushed back, standing to his full height. He moved to the window, looking out across the snow-laden prairie. The horizon was vast and empty, broken only by the thin line of cottonwoods along the creek. A hawk circled in the distance. "You won't last a day out there," he said, still facing the glass. "Storm's gone, but the cold ain't done." Her voice softened, almost breaking. "I never asked you to save me. I only begged for a fire. If you regret it, I'll walk." Luke's jaw tightened. He didn't turn right away. He'd always been a man who trusted the land more than people. Land didn't lie. Cattle didn't stab you in the back. But people, they carried hidden daggers. Still, he remembered the way she'd nearly collapsed by the fire last night, the frost clinging to her lashes, the fear in her voice when she'd begged him not to drive her out. He turned at last, hat brim shadowing his face. "You're staying until you can stand on your own 2 feet. After that, it's your choice." Her eyes widened, hope flickering like a timid flame. She nodded quickly, blinking back tears she refused to let fall. Luke sat again, finally biting into his bacon. But don't mistake my silence for ignorance. You've got ghosts following you, Clara. I can smell trouble like a rattler in the sage. And if it comes knocking on my door, his eyes pinned her with quiet warning. I'll be ready. Clara's fork rested against the plate, her knuckles white. But then, in a voice almost too soft to catch, she whispered, I'll be useful, Mr. Carver. I swear it. I won't be trouble. Luke didn't answer right away. He only chewed, the weight of his silence speaking louder than words. Outside, the hawk screamed against the empty sky, and the sound seemed to echo through the small cabin. Two strangers bound by circumstance, with trust as fragile as glass. And so the uneasy truce held, simmering like the coals in the hearth, with danger lingering just beyond the horizon. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Saloon. The snow had melted to slush by the time Luke hitched his horse outside of Dry Creek's only saloon, the Silver Spur. The sun was sinking low, bleeding red and gold across the horizon, painting the prairie in a fiery haze. Inside, laughter and music rolled through the swinging doors, piano notes clumsy but spirited, boots thumping on wooden floors, spurs clinking in rhythm with drunken shouts. Luke pushed his way in, shoulders broad enough to part the smoke-filled air. Heads turned. Some men tipped their hats, others scowled. Luke Carver wasn't a man to be trifled with, and most in Dry Creek knew it. He ordered a whiskey neat and leaned against the scarred oak bar, saying nothing. But silence was dangerous in a place built on noise, and silence drew whispers. You hear about Carver? A wiry ranch hand muttered 2 stools down, voice low, but not nearly low enough. Tookin' some stray woman. Just walked right into his cabin, they say. Stayed the night. A burly cattle drover chuckled, slamming down his beer mug. Figures. Man's been riding solo too long. Guess even old Carver's got himself a soft spot. The girl's pretty enough. The words dripped like poison into the room. More heads leaned in, voices hushed, curious. Or maybe she's running from something. A girl don't stumble half-dead onto a cowboy's porch without shadows on her back. Luke's jaw clenched as he sipped his whiskey. He hadn't spoken a word, hadn't turned his head, but the weight of his presence was heavy enough to make the bartender polish glasses a little faster, to make the piano player's tune falter before stumbling on again. Finally, Luke set his glass down with a soft but deliberate thud. Any man here got business with me, he said, his voice quiet but cutting to the chatter like a knife. Best bring it to my face instead of spit it in shadows. The room hushed. A few men looked away. A few others smirked, not brave enough to push further, but bold enough to fan the flames once Luke was gone. At the far table, however, someone did speak. A gambler in a black vest, cards spread before him like painted lies, leaned back in his chair. Funny thing, Luke Carver setting up house with a runaway. Could be she's trouble. Could be she's being hunted. Either way, his grin was a snake's. It'll land trouble right at your door. Luke didn't rise to the bait. He downed the rest of his whiskey, dropped coins on the bar, and walked out, spurs striking sharp against the creaking floorboards. Behind him, the murmurs flared again, louder now that his shadow had passed through the door. Back at the cabin, Clara was outside hauling and kindling. She wore his spare coat. The sleeves rolled, and her small hands gripped the wood with determination. When Luke rode up, she glanced at him quickly, eyes searching his face for some hint of his mood. Town was loud tonight, Luke said, swinging down from his horse. He untied the saddlebag and carried it inside without another word. Clara followed, setting the wood near the hearth. Did they talk about me? Luke looked at her then, really looked. Her posture was stiff, chin raised like someone braced for a blow. She already knew the answer. They talked, he admitted, pulling off his hat. He set it on the peg by the door. But talk's all it was. Her hands tightened around the edges of the coat. It won't stop there. It never does. Gossip grows, and men start to skin questions. Luke studied the fire, its flames gnawing at the logs. He could hear the strain in her voice, the way fear lived under every word. She wasn't just worried about gossip. She was worried about someone following the trail. They can talk, Luke said at last, voice low, steady. Ain't none of their business what happens under my roof. Clara sank into the chair by the fire, staring at the floor. After a long silence, she whispered, "It'll become their business if the men I ran from catch wind of where I am." Luke didn't answer. He only pulled a chair closer to the window, where he could keep an eye on the prairie stretching endless and bare into the night. His silence was heavy, but it wasn't cruel. It was the silence of a man thinking 3 moves ahead, weighing danger against the flicker of hope in his cabin. The coyotes wailed in the distance, and the fire cracked in the hearth. Clara sat trembling. Luke kept watch, and outside the whispers of Saloon carried like smoke across the prairie. Trouble already on the wind. Chapter 4. Shadows from her past. The prairie wore a strange stillness that week, the kind that made even the cattle uneasy. The sky was too clear, too wide, as though it were holding its breath. Luke Carver noticed it first. Tracks along the creek bed, horses that weren't his, moving heavy and fast. Outlaws by the look of them. He didn't say a word to Clara that morning, but he noticed how her eyes kept darting toward the horizon, as if she could feel ghosts riding it. She chopped vegetables by the fire, her hands quick and practiced now, but the tremor in her grip betrayed her nerves. That evening, Luke finally spoke. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching the sun slip red behind the cottonwoods. "You expecting company?" Clara froze. The knife hovered over the cutting board, her shoulders stiff. She didn't look at him when she answered. "Why would you ask that?" "Because I know a horse sign when I see it." Men rode through the creek bed. Not locals, either. His voice was steady, but his eyes pinned her like a hawk. "And you've been jumping at shadows since you walked through my door." She set the knife down with a clatter and pressed her palms flat against the table. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, in a whisper that cracked under its own weight, she confessed. "They'll never stop." Luke waited, silent as stone. "They took me 2 years ago," Clara said, her voice tight, as though each word dragged thorns from her chest. "A gang calling themselves the Carrion Hawks. Said I belonged to them. I cooked, I cleaned, Her voice broke, and she swallowed hard. "When I tried to run, their leader swore he'd find me, no matter where I hid." Luke's eyes darkened. He stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind him. "And now they're close." She nodded, clutching her hands to still their trembling. "I thought if I could just disappear far enough, maybe—" Her eyes lifted as at last, wide and desperate. "You shouldn't have let me stay. I've dragged danger to your doorstep." Luke didn't answer right away. He moved to the hearth, tossed another log onto the fire, and watched the sparks leap up the chimney. The flames lit the hard line of his jaw, the scar that cut across his temple. He'd seen this before. Women, families, whole towns broken under the boot heel of men who thought themselves kings of the frontier. "You think running forever will save you?" he said finally, his voice low. "It won't. Sooner or later, you gotta stand." Her breath caught, a small sound in the crackling silence. "Stand against them? You don't know what they're capable of." Luke turned then, eyes burning like coals. "Don't need to. I know what I'm capable of." For a moment, Clara said nothing. She only stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. He wasn't boasting. He wasn't trying to scare her. He was telling her the truth. He'd fight, because he didn't know how not to. But her fear was stronger than hope. She shook her head, rising from the chair. "They'll kill you if you try to protect me. And I can't." Her voice broke again, softer now. "I can't watch another good man die on my account." Luke crossed the room in 2 strides, stopping just short of touching her. His presence filled the space, steady as an oak rooted in a storm. "Clara," he said, her name rough on his tongue. "Trouble found its way here whether I invited it or not. You're under my roof. That makes it my fight, too." Her eyes shone in the firelight, torn between gratitude and terror. She wanted to believe him, but belief was a luxury she'd never been allowed. Outside, a lone coyote yipped, and from the distance came the faint echo of hooves on hard earth. Clara stiffened. Luke's hand went to the revolver at his hip. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice like a prayer. Luke didn't flinch. He pulled the brim of his hat low, checked the chamber of his coat, and gave her a look that was half warning, half promise. Then let him. The night closed in heavy and certain, and with it, shadows from Clara's past rode ever closer. Chapter 5, Gunfire at Sunset. The prairie bled red beneath the setting sun, long shadows stretching over the scrub brush and frostbitten grass. Luke Carver stood outside his cabin, rifle in hand, his boots planted firm in the dirt. The air was sharp, the kind that cut down deep into a man's lungs, but it carried something else too, the steady, distant thunder of hooves. Clara hovered just inside the doorway, fingers gripping the frame as if to anchor herself. She'd known this moment was coming since the day she stumbled into Luke's firelight. Her heart thudded against her ribs, a caged thing desperate to break free. "They're here," she whispered, her voice small against the vastness of the open land. Luke tipped his hat low, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Stay inside. Bolt the door if you have to." But Clara shook her head, trembling though she was. "I won't hide." Before Luke could argue, the carrion hawks crested the rise. 6 riders in all, their silhouettes black against the burning sky. At their head rode a man Clara knew all too well. Jed Crowley, a wolf of a man with a grin like broken glass. His coat whipped in the wind, and a rifle rested across his saddle like an old friend. Well, Jed called, his voice carrying across the still air. "Didn't expect to find you so easy, girl. You've been running a long time, but the hawks always catch what's theirs." Clara's breath hitched, but Luke stepped forward, calm and steady, raising his rifle to his shoulder. "She ain't yours," he said flatly. Jed laughed, cruel and sharp. "And who are you to say otherwise? Just another fool playing hero? Hand her over, Cowboy, and maybe I'll let you keep breathing till dawn." The other riders jeered, their horses stamping restless in the dirt. Guns gleamed in the last light of day, the promise of violence heavy in the air. Luke's voice was quiet but sure. "I don't hand people over. Not to men like you." The stillness shattered. In the same heartbeat, guns were drawn and fire erupted across the clearing. The crack of rifles and the thunder of pistols rolled like a storm breaking loose. Clara cried out but didn't retreat. Instead, she grabbed the box of cartridges and scrambled to Luke's side, hands shaking as she passed him fresh rounds. Luke fired with deadly precision, each shot deliberate, measured. One outlaw toppled from his saddle. Another wheeled his horse back, clutching a bleeding arm. Bullets tore into cabin's walls, splinters flying, the air alive with the acrid stench of gunpowder. "Down!" Luke barked, pulling Clara against the wall as a bullet shattered the water bucket by the door. She clutched his arm, terror flooding her eyes, but she didn't falter. Instead, she jammed another cartridge into his hand, her breath ragged. "I won't let them take me," she swore through trembling lips. "Not while you're standing." Luke's gaze met hers for the briefest moment, something fierce and unspoken passing between them. Then he swung back into the fight, his rifle barking flame into the dusk. The battle raged until the sun kissed the horizon. One by one, The hawks broke, retreating into the lengthening shadows. Only Jed lingered, his grin gone, his rifle trembling in his grip. "This ain't over, Carver," he snarled, backing his horse away. "The hawks don't forget. She'll never be free." Luke's rifle stayed leveled, but he didn't fire. Not yet. He let Jed ride off into the gathering dark, his words echoing like a curse across the prairie. When the last hoofbeat faded, the silence was deafening. Smoke drifted in the air, mingling with the dying light. Luke lowered his rifle, chest heaving with steady breaths, his hat shadowing the hard lines of his face. Clara stepped closer, her hands trembling but her chin lifted high. You stood for me," she whispered. Luke reloaded his rifle with a click, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "Wasn't ever a choice, Clara." The fire in the west dimmed to purple, the first stars breaking to the veil of night. The battle was over, but the war for Clara's freedom had only just begun. Chapter 6, Healing Hands. The prairie night lay heavy after the gunfight, silence broken only by the restless snort of Luke's horse and the crackle of dying gunpowder in the air. Smoke clung to the cabin, mingling with the iron tang of blood. Luke staggered against the doorframe, one hand pressed to his side. His shirt bloomed dark where a bullet had grazed deep across his ribs. He tried to wave Clara off, but his breath came ragged, the set of his jaw betraying the pain he fought to hide. "Sit down," Clara commanded, her voice trembling but fierce. She dragged the chair closer to the hearth and pushed at his shoulder. "Now." Luke hesitated, stubborn as stone, even with blood dripping through his fingers. But when his knees buckled, he allowed her to guide him into the chair. "You're wasting your worry," he muttered, gritting his teeth. "It ain't bad." Clara knelt before him, tearing strips from the hem of her dress with quick, clumsy hands. "Don't you lie to me," she shot back, eyes glistening. "You stood out there and bled for me. Let me do this." The firelight painted her face in flickering gold as she pressed the cloth to his wound. He hissed through clenched teeth, but didn't pull away. Her hands shook, but her touch was careful, steadying as the minutes dragged on. "Hold still," she whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the fragile thread of his strength. Luke studied her, silent. He'd seen women patch wounds before, back in cattle drives and border skirmishes. But Clara wasn't hardened by years of blood and dust. Every wince he made cut across her face, as though she felt it herself. "You've done this before," he said, his voice low. Clara didn't look up. The hawks fought often. "I patched them up when they tore each other apart." Her voice wavered, thick with loathing, but none of them deserved it. She tied the makeshift bandage tight, fingers brushing his skin. When she finally sat back on her heels, tears shimmered in her eyes. "I thought if I ran far enough, I could finally stop being theirs. But they always find me. And now," she shook her head, her voice breaking, "now I've doomed you too." Luke shifted, reaching out with a blood-stained hand. He caught her wrist gently, stopping the tremor. His eyes, shadowed on the brim of his hat, softened in a way she hadn't seen before. "You didn't doom me," he said. "I chose to fight." Clara's throat tightened. For so long, she had been nothing but a burden, a prize fought over, a shadow in someone else's story. No one had ever chosen her, only claimed her. And here sat a man who bled by his own will, not because she belonged to him, but because he decided she was worth standing for. The tears she'd held back spilled over, trailing hot down her cheeks. She bowed her head into her hands. "I don't know how to be anything but someone running. I don't know how to live free." Luke leaned forward, wincing, and with his roughened hand, he tilted her chin up until her eyes met his. His gaze was steady, calm as the open sky. "Then you learn," he said simply. Her breath hitched, a small sob caught in her throat. He wasn't promising her safety or fairy tale. He was offering her something harder, more real, the chance to build a life instead of flee from one. Clara pressed her hand against his, holding it there as though anchoring herself to that promise. The cabin glowed around them, the fire snapping and popping, shadows dancing across rough-hewn walls. Outside, the prairie stretched silent, vast, dangerous. But for the first time, the danger didn't feel insurmountable. For the first time in years, Clara felt the weight of her past lesson, just enough for hope to flicker. Luke leaned back, exhaustion finally pulling at him. Clara rose, fetching more wood for fire, tucking the blanket tighter around his shoulders. She moved with quiet determination, no longer the trembling stranger who had begged at his hearth. As she settled beside him, her hand brushed his once more, lingering there in the hush of the room. He didn't pull away. Outside, the coyotes howled, carrying their mournful songs across the plains. But inside, beneath the warm glow of the fire, two weary souls found something stronger than fear, something beginning to take root, fragile yet unshakable. Chapter 7. A Promise by Firelight. The storm clouds had rolled in again by the third night after the fight, drumming steady rain against the cabin roof. The sound was almost soothing, a curtain of water, sealing them off from the rest of the world. The prairie outside lay dark and drowned, but inside the cabin the fire burned warm, shadows dancing across the walls like restless spirits. Luke sat at the table, hat set aside, his bandaged side stiff beneath his shirt. He cleaned his revolver with slow, steady strokes, every motion deliberate. The man was carved from silence. Clara had learned that much in the short weeks she'd known him. He wasn't cruel with his quiet, but it weighed heavy, filling the spaces between them with questions she dared not ask. She sat across from him, mending one of his shirts by lamplight. Her fingers worked the needle carefully, though now and then she pricked herself, flinching before pressing on. The domestic calm felt almost foreign, a fragile piece they'd stolen from the chaos outside. But the silence grew too much for her tonight. "Luke," she said softly, eyes fixed on the stitching in her lap, "I don't want to be a burden to you." He paused, cloth in hand, then set the revolver down with a quiet click. His gaze lifted, steady and unflinching. "You're not." Her throat tightened. "You don't know that. Trouble follows me. You've already bled because of me." He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight, his hands folding across his chest. "And if it happens again?" Clara's sewing stilled. The needle hung in the air. Slowly, she lifted her eyes to him, the firelight catching in their depths. "Then I'll go. If staying here puts you in danger, I'll walk into that storm right now." Her voice cracked, but she forced it steady. "I couldn't stand watching you fall, because of me." The rain outside beat harder, wind rattling the shutters. Luke pushed away from the table, rising to his feet. His boots echoed against the floor as he crossed the hearth, standing with one hand braced on the mantel, his back to her. "You think I want you gone?" His voice was low, threaded with something that made Clara's breath catch. "You think I'd fight like hell against 6 men just to see you ride out into the night?" Clara rose, too, her hands trembling as she set the mending aside. She took a tentative step closer, the firelight brushing warmth across her pale face. "Then what do you want of me, Luke Carver?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. He stared into flames, as though wrestling with the words. Then he turned, his shadow falling long across the room, his eyes dark but burning with a quiet fire. "I want you here," he said simply. The words hit her like a shot, not loud, but enough to steal the air from her lungs. She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears welling despite her will. "Even if I got nothing to give," she whispered. Luke stepped closer, close enough that the fire's glow caught the edge of his jaw, the scar by his temple. "You've already given," he said. His hand lifted, hesitated, then brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. You gave me a reason not to sit alone with my silence. Her tears slipped free then, hot against her skin. She let out a shaky breath, leaning into the touch she hadn't known she needed so badly. I don't know how to be wanted, she admitted, her voice breaking. Luke's thumb lingered against her cheek, rough and gentle all at once. Then learn it here, with me. The fire popped, sending sparks drifting up the chimney, the sound filling the pause between their breaths. Clara nodded, her tears falling freely now, but her lips curved into the smallest, most fragile smile. By the firelight, a promise was forged, unspoken, but stronger than iron. She would no longer walk alone, and he would no longer face the prairie in silence. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, two souls found shelter not only from rain, but from the emptiness that haunted them both for too long. Chapter 8, Home on the Range. The first hints of dawn stretched across the horizon, painting the prairie in strokes of rose and gold. The storm had passed, leaving the land washed clean, the grass glittering with dew beneath the newborn light. From the cabin, smoke drifted from the chimney, curling into the sky like a quiet promise that life carried on. Luke Carver saddled his horse in the yard, his movement steady despite the bandage wrapped around his ribs. The pain was still there, but he bore it without complaint, as he always did. Clara stepped out onto the porch, shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. Her eyes followed him, wary yet hopeful, as though she still feared this fragile peace might vanish with the sunrise. "You ride into town?" she asked, her voice soft. Luke tugged the cinched strap tight, then looked up at her. "Town's been talking since you arrived. Best they see us together. Let the truth out in daylight, instead of leaving it to shadows." Clara hesitated, clutching the shawl. "And if they don't take kindly to it?" "Folks don't forget gossip easy." Luke swung into the saddle with a grunt, then reached down, his hand steady and waiting. "Then let him choke on it. We'll ride through all the same." Her heart thudded. For a moment she stood frozen, the weight of her past whispering she had no right to such a place beside him. But the firelight promise of nights before burned stronger than fear. She stepped forward, slipped her hand into his, and let him pull her up onto the horse. Together they rode into Dry Creek. The town stirred awake as they arrived, shutters banging open, boots thumping on boardwalks. A few ranch hands leaned against fence posts, watching as Luke guided his horse down the main street. Clara sat behind him, her hands gripping his coat, chin lifted though her heart pounded. At the saloon porch, the same cattle drovers who jeered before fell silent. The gambler in the black vest leaned back in his chair, hat tipped low, his smirk fading as Luke's eyes cut across him like steel. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared. The silence was louder than gunfire. Clara felt it pressing in, waiting for her to flinch. But Luke's voice broke through, calm and firm. "She's with me?" It wasn't shouted, wasn't boastful. Just 4 words, spoken like the turning of a key in a lock. The kind of words a man couldn't take back, and wouldn't want to. A few heads dipped, others turned away. But no one challenged him. The gossip that had once been wildfire fizzled to ash in the weight of his certainty. Clara's chest tightened, a sob rising she swallowed down. For the first time in years, she wasn't running, wasn't hiding. She was seen and claimed not as a possession, but as a partner. By noon, they were back on the open range. Luke let the horse slow, the wide prairie stretching endless ahead of them. The sun burned bright, chasing away the last of the night's chill. Clara slid down first, her boots sinking into the damp earth. Luke followed, wincing slightly as he adjusted aside. He looked out at the land, the rolling fields of grass, the cottonwoods lining the creek. His land, his life. "It's not much," he said quietly, almost gruff, "but it's steady." Clara stepped beside him, her hand brushing his, tentative but sure. It's more than I ever dreamed of. He turned to her then, eyes shadowed beneath his hat, but softer than she'd ever seen them. His rough hand took hers fully, gripping firm. Stay, Clara. Not because you're afraid, not because you got nowhere else, but because you want to. Her throat tightened, tears blurring the horizon. I do, she whispered. I want to. Luke exhaled, a sound half relief, half surrender. He pulled her close, the brim of his hat brushing her hair as he kissed her, tender and unhurried, the prairie wind carrying the moment like a hymn. Behind them, the dawn stretched wide and bright, the land vast and free. Ahead lay hardship, no doubt, but for the first time, Clara faced it not as a fugitive, but as a woman who had found her place. Home wasn't just a cabin in the wilderness. It was a man beside her, the promise forged in firelight, and the wide horizon they'd faced together. The sun hung low, bleeding fire across the wide plains, its last light painting the sagebrush gold. The dust of the day settled soft beneath the hooves of Luke's horse as he rode alongside Clara, the two silhouettes framed against a horizon that seemed to stretch forever. From town drifted the faint hum of saloon music, laughter, piano keys, the rattle of bottles. But out here, only the wind spoke, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of tomorrow. Clara glanced at Luke, her shawl whipping in the breeze, eyes alight with something she hadn't dared feel in years. Hope. He caught her gaze, and for once the stoic silence he wore like armor cracked into a smile, small but real. It's strange, she whispered, voice soft as the wind. I came here begging not to be driven out, and now I can't imagine leaving. Luke reined in his horse, turning to face her fully. The dying light caught the rough lines of his face, the scar at his temple, and the gentleness in his eyes meant only for her. He reached for her hand, callous fingers wrapping around hers. You ain't leaving, Clara, he said, his voice steady as bedrock. Not unless you're dragging me with you. Tears welled, but she smiled through them. Their hands stayed locked as the sun dipped, the sky awash in crimson and violet, sealing their promise against the vast silence of the west. Two weary souls, once alone, now bound by choice and by love, riding into a horizon that finally belonged to them both.